for this invitation. Distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen, it's my first time in Korea. I'm really enjoying it. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I will be talking about, in a way, I'm using the three terms, scaling, collective, and impact, and turn them around a little bit, like scaling, yes, but more impact on collective than on collective impact. But the point that I want to make is, in a way, to look at development of entrepreneurship from an individual perspective. And I'm looking at personal initiative, and I will be talking a little bit more about what that is. I hope I will convince you that this is an interesting concept. And so this is what we will be talking about. First question is, what is this idea of personal initiative? And it in principle includes three ideas and three concepts and one particular outcome. And the three ideas that it includes is self-starting, future orientation, and overcoming barriers. And the outcome of it is always a change in the environment. So in a way, it's the impact per se. It's an impact question per se, from an individual perspective, mind you. Now, let's think a bit more about what is self-starting, future-oriented, and overcoming barriers. But before we do that, let's look at the alternative. The opposite side of personal initiative is a reactive kind of approach. And I will be talking about this reactive approach from time to time again, and you will understand that this is an approach that does not have impact on the environment. Yeah? And there's little active pre-planning, there's no personal initiative, and often it's mimicking others that is part of this kind of reactive approach. And often it's rather helpless, quite frankly. When you talk to reactive entrepreneurs, you sort of get this impression of helplessness. Okay, so let's talk a bit more of what does it mean to be self-starting. In a way, every entrepreneur is self-starting, to some extent. So the question is, to what extent is the entrepreneur self-starting? So whenever we do everything that is normal in the environment, everything that everyone else is doing in the environment, then we are not in that sense self-starting. We are sort of reacting again to what is the usual kind of thing in the environment. So self-starting obviously always has an element of creativity and innovation in it. Self-starting always has the element of, I'm doing it slightly different than what other people are doing. And I don't mean self-starting now in the sense of that you change everything under the sun, but that you change slight, small things. And you will see when I give you examples what I mean by that. Because I'm talking about, in my empirical research, I'm taking the smallest of the entrepreneurs who exist in the world, and those are micro-entrepreneurs in Africa. Typically with about 1, 2, 3, up to 9 employees, 50 is a big enterprise, okay, in this kind of context. And therefore, I'm not talking about changing everything, but I'm changing a slight little bit. And by doing that and being self-starting, I change the environment a slight little bit. So, whenever a manager takes up everything that's in the air or that McKinsey tells them to do, that is not self-starting. But it may be self-starting how he or she does it. So there's still room for self-startingness, even if you listen to other people. So I'm not arguing against listening to other people. I'm not even arguing against learning from your competitors. But I'm arguing that every time you do it, there should be a slight element of self-starting. Future orientation. Again, let's not be crazy about it. So when we do our trainings with entrepreneurs in Africa, we're not trying to give them a 10-year plan, okay? This would be very German. You know, I'm a German, as you probably noticed. But it's no good, okay? But we give them and we demand from them that they develop a plan for the next 6 months. And this is a long-term plan in this kind of context. When I do the same kind of training in Germany, I don't think of the next 6 months. I think of the next 1 or 2 years, yeah? Just to put it in perspective. And if I talk to a Singaporean, 10 years is just good enough to be long-term. That's a joke. So, meaning of the last part is, so what do you have to look for in the future? You have to look for 2 things. Number 1 is the problems that will occur, and you have to prepare for them. And number 2 is the opportunities that are around, and you have to prepare for taking advantage of these opportunities. So therefore, it's so important to actually have an idea of which kind of opportunities might arise. I'm not saying that you can know the future. That's crazy. Yeah? But I'm saying that you can be prepared for potential opportunities and problems in the future. So, the last point is overcoming barriers. Nothing is more important than overcoming barriers for an entrepreneur. Everyone who has gotten to know any entrepreneur in the whole world knows that any entrepreneur doesn't have enough money, he doesn't have enough resources, he doesn't have enough knowledge of actually doing everything he needs to do, and there are problems at no end. Moreover, there are also internal barriers, like being frustrated, like being at the point where you say, oh, I don't care anymore, I don't want to do it anymore. This kind of thing, so that's an internally generated barrier. So we are talking about both self-discipline as well as discipline in overcoming the barriers that are coming from the outside. So this is an active dealing with problems instead of giving up. All right? So this is the concept of personal initiative. I call this concept a syndrome because they reinforce each other, okay? So the self-startingness comes often from a little bit more future orientation because I say, hey, I need to prepare for this now. The overcoming barriers actually is easier if you're self-starting because you can have more creative ways of overcoming the barriers. The overcoming barriers again gives you more confidence in being self-starting, etc. So they reinforce each other, and that's why I call it a syndrome. Okay. Now, I started this research, and this is a new slide for those people who have the slides in front of them. I started this research because I was interested in East Germany in the situation of reunification. And I couldn't resist to put something in on East Germany here as well, because it actually, I started the whole research idea of personal initiative because people came back from East Germany before unification, mind you, okay? And said there is so little initiative in East Germany, okay? So there were stories of people telling me that a university professor had to actually invite every professor and had to tell them, you do the following, you apply for a research grant, okay? And they would say, I don't know anything about research grants, yeah? Because that was the changeover process of reunification, that they suddenly had to get research grants and that they weren't be given the research grants by the party secretary, etc. So all of these kinds of things were new. A secretary, my friend became a professor in East Germany. He told me about his secretary, and he asked his secretary to call up somebody. And after a while, he said, did you call up this person? And she said, no, I didn't have the phone number. Yeah? So that's lack of personal initiative. Yeah? That's lack of being at all self-starting, even in small little matters. And this was the kind of thing that people told me existed, and so I was interested to see whether this was actually true, and it turns out to be true to some extent. So people were less initiating fortunately, we could show that the major reason why they showed less personal initiative at work was because they had less control at work, because actually Taylorism had taken a much stronger hold of how to do job design in East Germany than in West Germany. So even though Taylor, the good old Taylor, who sort of was the precursor of the assembly line, of the Ford's assembly line, he actually was a symbol of capitalism in the beginning, but Lenin always liked him. Always said that's what we need to do. We need to tailorize work situations, and that's what was taken quite strongly in East Germany. So I just show you very quickly an overhead. We got some data from the Secret Service of East Germany after the wall came down, okay, before they weren't on speaking terms with me. But we got some data from them in 1980, and we compared it to 1995, so 5 years after after reunification, or 4.5 years after reunification. And what you see here is that one of the big issues, you cannot see this very clearly here, but if I use the cursor, you can see that job control and complexity was much higher after, in 1995. NGS means the new German, or whatever, I don't even know the abbreviation anymore. The new German states, that's what they were called for a while, no longer. But this was sort of after the wall had come down. Before the wall had come down in 1980, even to the Secret Service, they said, we have no control. We have no control and no complexity in our job, or much lower. The work organization was in many ways in the old GDR, in the old German Democratic Republic, was much more organized in many ways, but organized from the outside. Yeah? The participation in suggestion schemes, even though they were really, really important in East Germany, was much lower. And what you see here, the relationship to the supervisor was much better. So there are pros and cons of the market economy. Anyhow, this is not what I wanted to really talk about. I wanted to talk about personal initiative. And this is the East German, West German comparison. We had one city in East Germany, a representative sample, one city in West Germany, a representative sample. And what you see here is overcoming barriers is indeed much, much lower in East Germany than in West Germany. And this is the kind of thing, I didn't have the phone number kind of stuff. No? Okay, but I'm talking not just about East Germany, West Germany, that's a digression. I'm now talking about entrepreneurship from now on. Okay. So, personal initiative and success. If you look in Uganda, the relationship is quite high between personal initiative and success, and it's quite high, the relationship in China, it's quite high, the relationship in Germany. We have done replication studies in many, 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 many different countries, and you always see that entrepreneurs who have a higher degree of personal initiative show a stronger success in their business. Okay? One of the things that we also found interesting is that those companies that had as a sort of company climate, as a company culture, a strong effect of personal initiative, a strong idea of personal initiative, were much more innovative. As you can see on this slide, there's a high relationship between error management culture, which is one part of personal initiative. And now, what do we do if we want to change it? And that's the big issue now. How do you change personal initiative? Now, as usual, there's always a genetic component in anything that psychologists touch, yeah? Because there's always a little bit of personality in the background, okay? So yes, there is a genetic component, but it's only one component. Yeah? So you can change personal initiative if you want to. And now let's look at what does it mean to show personal initiative behavior, rather than as a personality trait, but let's look at the behavior of personal initiative. So yes, what it includes is more creativity. But fortunately, creativity is something that you can change rather quickly and rather well. It's easy to change creativity. The next one is that you have to then really follow through and implement the kinds of self-starting ideas that you have when you go about things more creatively. And again, this is something that you can learn, and relatively easily. Can you learn to think more long-term? You can just force yourself to think long-term. It's not that difficult. Yeah? So whenever we force people to think long-term, they can think long-term. The problem is it's not nice to think long-term, and sometimes you have the feeling it's a waste of time. Yeah? Because I don't know anyhow what's happening tomorrow, so why should I? Yeah? And so it's not something that comes automatic in most people, but it's possible to do it. You can show that kind of behavior. Overcoming barriers is probably the most difficult of all, because it implies all sorts of things. Number one is, of course, it implies that I accept that there are barriers. Number two is that I deal with them in such a way that I really manage to overcome them. Yeah? This implies both creativity as well as knowledge, as well as background, as well as asking others, etc., etc. It's a big, big biggie. Yeah? So I'm not saying this is easy, and that is something where you have to train yourself to actually do that much better. But the most important part of it is, of course, that you say, I will overcome the barriers. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to just sit down and tell the world how difficult everything is. I'm just going to get off my back, my seat. I didn't want to say ass. And do things, all right? So this is possible to do. Now, if you want to change this kind of behavior, there are certain prerequisites, and I hope that I can convince you that these are necessary prerequisites. Not every one of the dimensions we have good data on, quite frankly. But for the whole thing, we have good data on. And the first thing is always, we should never ever be extreme in the way we do training by saying you can only learn through practice or you can only learn through knowledge. And the major point from my theoretical perspective is we should always bring these two things together. What is knowledge? Knowledge is often in today's world scientific knowledge. Yeah? So if we know this is a better strategy to work as an entrepreneur, we should know about that. Yeah? We shouldn't just be blind to that. So scientific knowledge should be incorporated into the training. But on the other hand, it is absolutely, and I say this very, very brutally, it's absolutely useless to just teach. And I'm a teacher. Huh? I'm a professor. Huh? But to just teach is useless if you want to change behavior. If you want to change knowledge, it's beautiful. Huh? But knowledge is not doing it. Okay? Knowledge, the way from knowledge to actually doing things is a long, long way. Just teach people the principles of physics. You have a 4-year-old learning to ride the bicycle, first time. You teach them the physical laws, and they will not fall down. Come on. Yeah? Makes no sense. Yeah? They need to do both. They need to learn the physical laws. In some ways, that helps, even for a 4-year-old. At the same time, they also need to ride the bicycle. Yeah? So the point then is, you need to combine the two. What's a physical law that is, now don't ask me about the physical law, by the way, I don't know. But what is a rule of thumb that you can teach a 4-year-old? You can teach a 4-year-old to take the handlebar in the direction you fall. Yeah? And not the opposite direction, because the opposite direction, you really fall. If you take the handlebar in the direction you fall, you tend to fall, you can actually catch yourself. Yeah? So these are the kinds of things that I mean by rule of thumb, and I mean by having science actually tell you which kinds of rules of thumb you should have. Okay? So, that means, and that's very important, that you should be able to reflect on it. Not mindless action is the point. Okay? There's a group of entrepreneurship scholars who actually argue, just learn by trial and error. Okay? I'm not arguing against errors. Okay? I love errors, but I am very much against trial without thought. So we have to have thoughts in our errors. So we should make our errors in such a way that they're thoughtful. And we should make our trials in such a way that they're thoughtful. Then you actually learn from them. If you just do things blindly, you don't learn from them. And I can show that experimentally to you. Yeah? So the next one is, because it's so important that all of this is done via actions, we have to really focus everything on these actions. And one of the things that we, for example, suggest when we do training for novices, people who are not entrepreneurs, and we do that we have done it with pretty much every university in Uganda, and we have done it with about 30 universities in Africa and worldwide, but primarily in Africa. And the first thing we say is, on day 1 of the training, you are going to start a business. On day 1. Why? Because it's useless to teach people abstract knowledge. It's useful to immediately combine the knowledge with this kind of situation. I have a business. Okay, I have to run. You have to learn these skills, routinization of new behavior. You have to learn new skills, and you have to learn them a little bit. Routinization should start in the training process, if at all possible. So let me just walk you through very quickly of how we think. We think that action, any action, but also entrepreneurial action, is related to goals, to information search, to planning, to feedback. No further discussion of that. Now we use these terms, goals, yeah, on this side. Okay. So you have on this side the goals and the information collection and the planning and the feedback. And then once you have that, on the other side we have self-starting, proactive, which is future orientation, and overcoming barriers. And then we have a sort of facet model in which we can look at all the different facets that are important for entrepreneurship. Okay? And this is how we develop our training. In a way, it sounds like very German to you. Developing a facet model and, fixing everything. But it's very practical because we have a case study, we have an exercise, we have a way of working together on each one of these things, okay? So it's a very practical way of theorizing, okay, that I want to show to you. And this is what we then do. We look at action principles for each one of those things, and action underlying learning goals, etc. And then it becomes quite good and quite interesting, and I just show you for the planning part what this implies. So we develop for each point, we develop sort of scientifically based action principles. Yeah? The science of planning is quite well developed. We can decipher that, and we can make principles of action. Principles of action should be understandable without the science in the background. We don't teach the science in the background to the entrepreneurs, but we teach based on the science in the background, those action principles, okay? So this is what we do, and we teach them things like self-starting. Your plan must imply that you can execute it now, okay? If you're self-starting in 5 years from now, you're not self-starting, okay? So you need to be able to start executing now. This is very important because every time you are in resource-constrained environments, people say, oh, I can't do it, I don't have the resources. Yeah? And we always say, don't care about resources, what can you do now to actually acquire them if you need them? Yeah? Or maybe you don't need them, yeah? Which would be even better. The next one is then proactive thinking, etc., etc. Every time you use creativity techniques, and some of them I'm sure you know better than I do. Okay? Now, I'm not going to really do this with you, but this is one exercise we do. And I love this exercise because it makes you feel bad. Okay? So I do it routinely with people, but I don't have the time now. Even in my talks, I tell them, think of yesterday. Think what you did between 9 and 10, 10 and 11, 11 to 12, 12 to 1, etc., etc. And then you tell me whether you were reactive, answering emails, kind of stuff. That's why it makes me feel bad. And then you ask the question, when were you proactive? When were you showing personal initiative? Yeah? When were you, and for example, with students, it's wonderful. You know, how often have you gone to a lecture without asking which kinds of questions do you want to get answered? Yeah? So if you go to a lecture and you know which kind of question you want to get answered, you show personal initiative. Yeah? Because you make sure that, hey, I still need an answer to my question, kind of thing. Yeah? This is the way to show personal initiative. Yeah? So the same thing, of course, in every business situation that we are in, have I actually shown personal initiative. Yeah? So what you find typically, if you do it right, is that you do feel bad because you don't show it often enough. Yeah? And what you also then find out is whether people actually really have the right concept of personal initiative, whether it's a real useful concept or not. You sort of discuss it. Yeah? Okay, so if you look at all of these effects, and we did a study, one of our first studies was done in Uganda with Ugandan business people, you find that they have 35% increase or 27% increase of sales. They have, the number of employees increases by 35%. And the control group is actually going down. Unfortunately, it was a difficult situation by and then. Now, let me just tell you one additional methodological issue. We always do a randomized control group design. As you know, this is now old hat because the other day, the two founders in economics got the Nobel Prize by using randomized control group design, essentially by using this kind of thing. Now, this was done slightly prior to their first study, but we published it, unfortunately, 10 years afterwards. But the idea is the same thing. Like medicine, you don't want to waste people's time. You also don't want to get people hot, and then they can't do it, okay? So you don't want to actually do negative, you know, you want to do good, but based on science rather than on your own feelings of feeling good by doing good. Yeah? So the point then is, you always want to show experimentally whether your system of thinking works. And quite frankly, for me, this was a huge change. And quite frankly, it was also a huge change because I get more negative feedback in that way. Because sometimes experiments do not work. Yeah? And it always makes you smarter. If you believe, like one of the guys I interviewed was a very, very long established trainer, he said, I have a 99% success rate. And I said, so what's the success? Oh, they all feel better afterwards. You know, I asked them, was this a good training? Yeah, this was a good training. Yeah? crazy idea. As it turned out, it was 0. His effect size was 0. Yeah? No effect whatsoever on objective indicators like sales or profitability. Okay? So we don't want that around. But this would be an example. So let me just give you an example. This is an example from Uganda. And this was one participant. They developed aluminum saucepans in Kampala. And he went through the training. He had to do a 3 months or 6 months plan for the future. And he said, what I want to do is I want to have my saucepans to be of higher quality so that I can sell them in the formal sector of the supermarkets, okay? So he went to the National Bureau of Standards. He was back and forth, etc., and he improved. And at the end, he had a 10 million Uganda shilling suggestion contract with a supermarket chain. Now this is what I mean by small. It's still small, okay? He just changed his old saucepans to make them better quality, yeah? But it was a big, big change for him and his success, okay? Now we talk about scaling, okay? One of the things here was scaling. This was a very small experiment. Now we scale it up. And now, fortunately, I have now a good working relationship with the World Bank, and this was a World Bank project. And what the World Bank was doing, they were saying, hey, let's look at experimentally how good the trainings are that we typically give to people. And then they said, let's look at an alternative, and this crazy Michael Frese, he always says that personal initiative is important. So let's see whether it actually is, okay? And this was published in Science, and in essence, the heading of the article gives away the whole thing. Teaching personal initiative beats traditional training in boosting small business in West Africa. Yeah? So what did we do? We did a randomized controlled experiment with 500 people in each, entrepreneurs in each group. One group got the traditional business training, which was very good, really good. And it was really well organized business training. The idea of the organized business training was better business practices, more formalization, more money from the banks, more profits. Yeah? And 500 people in the personal initiative training, you have an idea of what that is. Huh? We don't teach them anything in terms of getting money. We teach them don't use money. Yeah? Think of alternatives to money. Yeah? Bootstrapping. Yeah? Asking your friends for a few dollars here, your partner for a few dollars there, and get the dollars, damn it. Yeah? Don't wait until you get them from the outside. And the small microcredits, they're too expensive anyhow. Yeah? So we don't teach them anything of that sort that was taught in the other program. So, and then 500 were in the control group. These were males and females, manufacturing, commerce, service, mean number of employees, about 3, average firm age. These were all existing entrepreneurial units, 12 years. And the average was 145 euros, that was the average mean profit. So, business edge, I already described. Personal initiative, I already described. Now we look at the data. So these are the data, and I want to concentrate on the monthly profits, and I give you a few more. What you see here is that the traditional business training does have an effect. Unfortunately, it's not significant. And whenever it's not significant, we don't take it that seriously. Huh? These are 500. There was enough power to actually detect differences. As you see, the personal initiative training has a really whopping effect. It's 30% higher than in the control group, and it's 20-something higher than in the traditional business training, and that's significant. Okay, next one. Business practices. The strange thing is, business practices actually did work for business training. So they did go slightly higher. Even though we didn't really train business practices, they became higher, much higher, they became as high, as traditional business training for personal initiative training. Unfortunately, all of that wasn't so significant. But innovation index was. So they innovated more. They also diversified more in the personal initiative training. And they had a higher degree of personal initiative. And they had a higher degree, and that really threw my friends from these are all senior economists. Oh wow, you're very generous, I get 5 more minutes. These are senior economists in the World Bank. And they said, well, the real issue is always getting money. Huh? I mean, finance, after all, we're into this kind of area. And they were really flabbergasted that personal initiative training led to a higher degree of labor and capital input. Now, quite frankly, you can, of course, argue, and people have done that, they did include more family members as labor input. Yeah? They also included more family members to actually get money input. Yeah? But they succeeded. And that was indeed one of the mechanisms by which they got higher sales. Yeah? So, this is when you look at it. We, of course, did that several times. We asked 4 times after the training how they were doing. And what you see here is that the personal initiative training, that's the red line, it goes up and it stays up. But they all went down at one point in time, which was unfortunately in Togo, the time of the election, and in Africa, elections is always a time when business is really hard, okay? So all of them went down, but at the end, the personal initiative training was actually 57% higher than the control group. You see in the middle, the blue line is the traditional business training, and the green line is the control group. So what do we learn from all of this? How do we want to reduce poverty? Obviously, this is in a way a direct introduction of poverty, yeah? Reduction. Because what we are doing is, these are people who are not making an enormous amount of money, yeah? But they are now able to, for example, get their children to go to school, yeah? To stay in school. They get their environment to actually flourish a bit more because they do have more employees over time, etc. All of these kinds of factors are important effects of this kind of personal initiative training. So why would you say, why concentrate so much on just one syndrome, even if it's an important syndrome? Why concentrate so much? And my answer is, because it's more important to concentrate on one thing rather than mix too many things. We have newer data where we mixed business training with personal initiative training, and the effect is actually worse than just doing personal initiative training. Why? Because people are confused what they have to take from the training. If you're single-minded like me, and you say, it's only that, and I only want to teach this, and I want to see whether it really works, okay? It actually is not so bad to do that in affecting and scaling up the effects of a change in one area of important behaviors for entrepreneurs. So we have done this in many countries, and this is just studies in general, but also intervention studies in some of them. But that's just showing off. You don't have to take that too seriously. The important thing is, whatever you do, concentrate, be scientific, look at how you can translate the science into principles of actions and teach them in detail, with action behind it and with action feedback behind it. All the time, it must be an active approach. And then, in the end, check whether it's really true. that it works. Thank you so much.